But the thing is that the Stafford Gambit has defeated my students in many games. and it's about time, we have something solid against it, because I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's just going to be around for a while. And let me just say, in case it isn't clear, me and Eric are good friends. I'm not doing this to start a feud or rivalry, anything like that. I really love Eric's content, and I think he's an absolute genius when it comes to coming up with new ideas. But the students come first, and I know you guys are suffering a lot and losing a lot of games to the Stafford. And I just want to help you guys out, so you have at least some prep for it, something in mind, some weapon to use against it. Okay, well, let's get into the Stafford. So here's my recommendation. Knight c6, we take on c6. Here, black most of the time goes d takes c6. And the reason they're doing that is so they can play bishop c5, and their queen is already opened up to go to the d4 square, and it doesn't let white play d4 themselves so easily. Right, we can't play d4 here because the e4 pawn is hanging, so we have to start with some other move. If black were to play b takes c6, then I would just play knight c3 in this position. And bishop c5 doesn't really make a lot of sense, because white can just play d4 and take over the whole center. And we're essentially just a pawn up, and we have the center. So white is just much, much better. Black could try something like bishop b4 here, and I just want to include this line because I think it's a pretty instructive one. There are different ways for white to play, but I think a really simple way to get an advantage is to play bishop e2 in this position. And we are letting black win back the pawn with takes and knight takes e4. But then we get this thematic move queen d4 in, where we hit the knight, we hit the g7 pawn. And black's only way to defend both, let's say, is knight f6. Then white can continue bishop to g5. And we've given the pawn back, but if we just look at the position, let's just forget what happened in the past couple moves. Let's just forget that we're up a pawn, now we gave the pawn back. Let's just evaluate this position at face glance, or face value, excuse me. We're just castling queenside here. We have two extremely active bishops. The dark squared bishop is an unopposed bishop. Black does not have a dark squared bishop of their own. And I think white's position here is just fantastic. We're going to castle queenside. Rook is going to come to the e-file. Our two bishops are super active. And any moment we can take on f6 and double black's pawns, although I think this would be cashing in a little bit too early. I would prefer to keep this pressure deep into the middle game and just play the position, playing for the initiative. And once we castle, I'm really not worried about the b-file here, because it's very difficult for black to add any attackers to the queenside. So yeah, b takes c6 is definitely not too serious of a move, but I just wanted to mention it just for completeness sake. So let's go into d takes c6. The move I would like to recommend is d3. And the setup that I'm going to be recommending is to play bishop e2, which does a good job of covering the g4 square, and then slowly building the center with c3, d4, because black is usually going to be putting the bishop out on c5. But even if they don't, I would say this is a good plan. Sometimes white might need to throw a knight d2 in order to defend the e4 pawn first, and then play c3, d4 and get a big system, big center, excuse me. And the knight on d2 can also, in some lines, be developed back to f3, where we have a very nice knight on the king side. I know that this f3 line is pretty popular, and I think objectively it's probably totally fine for white. I think the idea is to play for c3 as well, and then build a big center with d4. But honestly, I don't really see the advantages of this one, when, in my opinion, the bishop on e2 does the same job of defending the g4 square, and we don't make this kind of long-term weakness like we do with f3. So in a blitz game, I would say if there's no reason to play f3, if there are lines just as good, then I don't really quite see the point of playing this one. If f3 was the only good move in the position, then I would be recommending f3 right now, but it's not. I think white has options that are just as good, if not better. So I don't really see the practical value of doing this, especially in blitz where you're going to have to deal with kind of the long-term weakness that we're making with this move. So yeah, my recommendation is to go d3. Okay, now black here, I think 99% of the time plays bishop c5. And then white should follow up with bishop e2. So we're simply developing and recovering the g4 square. And we're going to look at, I think, two moves here. The old move, which is to play knight to g4. And the modern way, let's call it, of playing this line, which is to go h5. Which, again, many of my students have lost to exactly this position. Because there are some tricks that we have to watch out for. First, let's take a look at knight g4. So the point here is that black is attacking f2, of course, and we can take this one, and I think we should. Now black's idea is to play queen h4, so this is how they're winning back the piece. They're threatening mate, and they're threatening the light-scored bishop. There's different ways of playing this position. Like, for example, I think queen f3 is a very reasonable move, where black plays bishop takes g4 here. The idea is to go queen g3, and we offer a queen trade with an extra pawn, so we should be very happy in any endgame where we're kind of a pawn up. No real compensation for black. Instead, I would imagine black is going to try to keep the queens on the board with something like queen to h5, and I do think white's position here is quite good. For example, one line that's kind of funny is we can go h3, just hitting the bishop, and if black plays bishop d1 here, threatening mate, we play knight c3, defending mate, attacking the bishop, and then after bishop takes c2, we can play this funny move king d2, and black's bishop is actually trapped and white is winning a piece, and black doesn't have much compensation for it. I mean, black won the pawn back, but now they're going to be losing a full bishop. I'm not going to recommend this one because I think it's a little tricky. For example, when bishop takes d3, queen takes would run into a pin on the d file. So we probably have to play king takes. And I think white is winning here, but it's not necessary to go into all these complications. Although I did want to mention that queen f3 here is a very reasonable move. I think the simpler choice is just to play g3. And now we're forcing a queen trade because we're up a piece from earlier. So black has to take on g4 with the queen. If they take with the bishop, then they're going to end up a piece down after gh4 takes, king takes. White's just a piece up. So they have to play queen takes g4. And then we can trade queens. Bishop takes. And I would play the move h3 here, just to put the question to the bishop and force the bishop to move. Now black has a big choice. Either they play bishop f3, or they go back and just kind of accept being a pawn down. If they do play bishop f3, then we can go ahead and castle here. And now the main idea for white is to just kick this bishop out with knight d2 next. And once we get knight d2 in, the bishop just can't stay on f3, and white is going to be slowly consolidating the extra pawn, actually pretty quickly. So there's really not a lot of compensation here for black. Knight d2 is coming, and it's a big problem. I was thinking maybe black could try like f5, just as a provocative move. We can take, let's say, castles queenside, bishop e3. And this is a pretty typical idea in these kinds of positions. We want to try to trade off one of black's bishops because black has the bishop pair. By trading it off, we kind of neutralize that advantage and we leave ourselves with some extra material. So long story short, I don't really believe in this endgame for black. And if we just go back here, after h3, let's say black goes back something like bishop e6, then I think really simple move to play here is just bishop e3. And this does allow black to double the pawns, but I think these double pawns in the center are actually quite strong. The pawns on the light squares do a great job of restricting the light square bishop, and this pawn on the dark square covers some extra squares as well. And so the plan here for white is just to develop. The king can actually live very comfortably on d2, you can bring a rook to the f file, and then the knight maybe transfers to e2 and f4 or d4. And I think white is just doing great. Hey, thanks Paspon for the 5 gifted subs. Much appreciated. I know some people are very happy to be to now finally have something against the dreaded Stafford. So you're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, let's go back. Now, if you play this system nowadays, I think a well-prepared Stafford player is probably going to hit you with h5. And there is some trickery here, but as long as you follow the plan and just follow like basic guidelines, it's pretty straightforward. So I recommend to play c3 here. And this is the plan. We're playing c3, and we're trying to build a big center with d4. If we get d4 in, the bishop on c5 gets shut down. Black's compensation is very minimal. So I think black really has to be very active here and play a move like knight to g4. Now I think some players, they like to be a little tricky, and they play this move bishop b6. And the idea is that they back up so that if you play d4 now, it doesn't come with tempo, and black can take the e4 pawn. But here's where I would suggest just playing this prophylactic move knight d2, where we develop the knight, we defend the e4 pawn in advance, and now we're ready to push d4 next. So for example, knight g4, we can play d4. The bishop on b6 is shut down. Let's say queen h4, for example, they might continue. White can go g3, and there's really not much in this position for black. If queen h3, then there's bishop f1, kind of a nice move, trapping the queen. And when the queen goes back, let's say queen f6, we can cover the mate again with knight to f3. So very important that we're covering the key weakness in our position, the f2 pawn. And if black tries something super aggressive like h4, I think we can just go ahead and take this one. I really don't see where black's threats are coming from, but our bishop is coming to g5, and then we can play queen d2, and in the long run, possibly castle queenside. We should first throw in h3 here to kick the knight. In fact, h3 can be white's next move in this position because we don't really want to allow this knight to live on g4 for very long. Okay, let's go back. So the main move is knight g4. This is usually how Stafford Gambit players play this one. And again, I've had a lot of student games that go down this path. They play d4, and now black hits them with queen h4. If black does not play this move, queen h4, if they do something else, like dropping back with the bishop, then white's next move should be h3 here, usually in these positions. h3 is just a very important move for us to play because we just don't want to let black's knight hang out on g4 for the rest of the game, right? The knight on g4 is active, it puts a lot of pressure, it prevents us from developing the bishop to e3 where it would like to go. Our setup here, that kind of ideal, like bishop e3, knight d2. Yeah, so we want to play h3 here, bishop e3, knight d2. We get all of our pieces out. And again, we have an extra pawn, big center. Black is very minimal compensation. If after h3 here, let's say black tries something like queen h4, pinning the pawn and hitting f2, then typical response is g3. And now two of black's pieces are hanging, and this is a big problem. And if black takes on f2 here, for example, I think we could probably take back, but even easier, just take on h4. They take our queen, we win the knight, and white has a piece up. So let's recap. h5, white is pushing c3, trying to build for d4. Knight g4, white pushes d4. Now black has to try queen h4. So white should play g3, hitting the queen. And now the bishop on c5 is still hanging. Queen on h4 is hanging. So black has only one move here, queen f6, reigniting the threat against the f2 pawn. And this is really the key move, maybe in this whole line. Bishop f3. So this is a really important move to defend the f2 pawn. A lot of players play f3 in this position, again, including my students. And I think objectively this move is good, but it actually gets very, very tricky after this move h4. And so in a blitz game, I don't think this is something we really want to enter unless we feel very well prepared. Because it's pretty sharp. Black wants to take on g3, then the rook opens up on the h-file, and white could get into huge, huge difficulties here very, very quickly. So instead, bishop f3, much safer move, much more simpler for white to handle. Our idea is to play h3 next, Remember, h3 is always the move we're trying to get in this position. It kicks the knight backwards. Then the bishop can come out to e3, knight can come to d2, and we can complete our development and one day castle queenside. So now black is kind of out of tricks. They finally have to play bishop b6 here. And now we can go ahead and kick the knights. If h4 from black anyway, that's a good question. Let's say black plays h4 in this position. There's simply not enough. We can, I think, either take the knight on g4 or take on c5. I'd probably just take this knight because this is the most annoying piece. And the bishop on c5 is still restricted. Then after hg3, we can recapture fg. Of course, we don't want to hang our rook on h1. And black just doesn't have any tricks here. Bishop on g4 is defended. So that's the big difference. h4 we can just take on g4, whereas if we started with f3 here and black goes h4, then taking after hg, very, very complicated position because our king is opening up, there's play on the h-file, black's g-pawn might survive to be very dangerous and become a queen one day. I don't think we really want to enter this without being prepared. So bishop f3, that's kind of the big difference. So bishop b6, h3, and now the knight simply has to go back. There's no real way for black to try and continue here in, let's say, an active way. Some players, you know, they make some other moves here, but this h3 move, I think, very, very important to just kick the knight so it doesn't cause you any grief. Then after knight h6, for example, white can just continue developing here, bishop e3. I think the compensation is more or less over. We want to play knight d2, maybe put our queen on e2, castle queenside. I'll just show you guys sample line. Let's say bishop e6, knight d2, queenside castling, queen e2. Let's say black goes rook he8. And just looking at the position, if we just forget all of our feelings about the Stafford Gambit, and we just look at the position at face value, white is just doing great. Big center, extra pawn. Black's knight on h6 is on the side of the board. Black's bishop on b6, very restricted. Sure, it feels like black might have some play along the central files, but our center is very, very nicely defended. This is not like the Benko Gambit where the pawns on the queen side are vulnerable. These pawns are very nicely defended. And here there's actually lots of moves that white can play in this position. You can play bishop takes h5. There's nothing wrong with that. You can play h4, threatening bishop g5. You can actually castle, and then on bishop takes a2, push b3, and the bishop is trapped. But if you don't even want to enter those kinds of complications, you can often just start with a4 in this kind of position, threatening to push a5. This is a pretty thematic idea. And then once black deals with this threat, let's say with a5 or with a6, now you can castle queenside, and white's king is perfectly safe because we're controlling the center. We can play, well, be careful about knight c4, right? Because takes, bishop on f3 is hanging. So this is maybe one way we can blunder here. But we can take on h5, we can drop the bishop back to g2, and then go knight c4. Lots and lots of plans here for white. h4 is another one, once again, just trying to get the bishop to g5. And from here, you play chess, guys. I mean, we can't prepare this to death. I think it's already a little bit of overkill. Honestly, once we get this position, we should be totally fine. Big center, extra pawn, and game over. Okay, so let me review just the main line of this to give people a quick cliff notes on the ideas. And then I'll look at some bonus lines if you guys have any further questions. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. We have the Stafford. We take the Stafford. We go d3, bishop c5, bishop e2, carving the g4 square. If knight g4, we take this one. Queen h4, we go g3. We force the queen trade with queen takes g4. Takes, we castle. Oh, excuse me, we go h3. Then we castle next, and then knight comes to d2. And we cover this square, or we play bishop e3, and we trade off the dark square bishops. So let's go back. Instead, black's main move is to play h5, which is the trickiest move. And here we continue c3. And our idea is to push d4 and take over the center. If black drops back and this pawn is hanging, then we start with knight d2. We defend the pawn in advance. Now it's very difficult for black to stop d4. Another idea is to play knight c4 here, followed by a4, and just taking black's dark square bishop, which is also very, very fundamentally sound concept. So usually after c3, black is playing knight g4, going after the f2 pawn. We play d4 to shut down the bishop. Black goes queen h4. We play g3 to deal with the threat. Black goes queen f6. And we go bishop f3 to cover the f2 pawn. Now the counterplay for black is basically running out. They have to drop their bishop back because it was hanging. And here, very important that we kick this knight off of g4 so we don't have to deal with any more tricks. And from here, we can start developing, for example, bishop e3, knight d2, queen e2, and then we're ready to one day either castle queenside or throw an a4 first, and then castle queenside. White is in very good shape. We got a big center extra pawn, and we should be able to handle ourselves from here. Now, if you still lose the game after getting such a dominating position, guess what? It happens. You're playing blitz. Blitz is very volatile. Blitz is not just about whoever has the better opening prep. You still have to play good chess in the middle game. So I would discourage you guys, strongly discourage you from treating the opening as some kind of memory test where if you just remember the right moves, then you win the game. That's not it at all. The opening is a way for you to get a good position in the middle game, but it usually doesn't just win the game for you. You still have to play well. You have to build your advantage, handle your pieces and your pawns properly, look for tactics, look for ideas from the opponent, and only then can you actually win the game. Is just taking the knight bad? Well, let's see, depends on the position. If we take here, for example, then black gets their light squared bishop in. And since we've given up the light squared bishop, this is going to be a problem for us. So this is an example where black does get some real compensation because the light squared bishop is going to be a super strong piece attacking a lot of the weak squares in our camp. So if we don't have to give up our light squared bishop, I'd rather not, right? Bishop f3, then we can just kick the knight and relegate it back to the h6 square. Okay, there was some questions earlier about the knight c3 and queen e2 line. Honestly, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at this one. But for me, again, it's one of those things where, like, if we can just get a very decent position playing normal moves like d3, bishop e2, then I don't really see a reason to investigate this line, right? This one to me seems positionally suspect because we're blocking in our own bishop. If the engine improves, then I'm sure it's probably fine, and I'm sure white can get an advantage here. But for me, this line is just already good enough, and so there's no real reason to do something awkward like playing f3 or knight c3, queen e2. I just think this line is very straightforward. It's honestly not difficult to remember as long as you keep in mind your idea to play c3, d4, building the center. And from here, it's just a matter of dealing with black's threats. The way players often go wrong is that they just play very fast in the opening. And so they play quickly and then they mess up because they just made a move too fast. That was actually incorrect. All right, so if you're ever not sure in the opening, guys, is just a general tip. Just like take a little bit of time, take a couple seconds. You don't have to just be like super reactive. But I see that a lot. I see that in many different openings where someone is just playing moves on autopilot, not even paying attention to what the opponent is doing. They're just sticking to the same setup over and over again. And this happens in the London, but it happens in many other openings as well. I've seen it happen in the Sicilian, where someone is just playing their same setup against the Sicilian over and over again, regardless of what their opponent is doing. This is not a good way to play chess. A good way to play chess is actually think about your moves, make sure you're responding to your opponent's ideas and following some kind of consistent plan, but staying flexible so you're willing to adjust when the opponent throws something different at you. So yeah, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this lecture.